welcome to Games as Lit 101. I know this probably isn't any sort of big revelation to you all, but I think we're just about done with needing everything to be really dark and gritty. I think we're on the tail end of a time when we're trying to overcorrect for all the silliness and kid-friendliness of our past. I mean, Batman used to be unbearably cheesy, so now let's make everything he's ever in super dark and serious. Watchmen provided a dark look at the superhero genre, so let's make everything that dark now. And Transformers was too much fun as a cartoon, let's just suck all that out and make everyone take everything super seriously while punching each other a lot. Video games specifically are in an interesting position because their drive to make things dark and edgy has another source of pressure. Society still sees video games as children's toys. This is a culture where a politician can be smeared for playing World of Warcraft, where Apple explicitly states that apps don't deserve the same policies as books, and a video game based on an important battle in the Iraq War gets protested into oblivion because it's offensive to make a toy about something real people died in. So in order to be taken more seriously, video games have been trying to shake the idea that they're for kids, and one of the most obvious options is to be super adult and mature about everything. Unfortunately, that tends to come across as desperate and childish more than actually mature, but it's been the common approach. Because, you know, what Bomberman was missing was definitely the agonized screams of your enemies as they burn to death. Now, if you've been watching my show, you know that I have absolutely no problem with art taking itself seriously. In fact, more often than not, I'd prefer it does. But there is a problem with art that feels the need to present itself as more serious and more mature than it actually is, just for the sake of appealing to those hip and edgy kids these days. There's nothing wrong at all with having a dark and edgy story. The problem is when a story is dark and edgy for the sake of being dark and edgy. That is to say, it's an excellent means to an end, but it's a really bad end in and of itself. Some of you may remember my very first episode, where I analyzed Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, and made a brief mention of my seething hatred for its sequel, Warrior Within. I just wish I could... Sorry, I really hate Warrior Within, but I'm sure I'll get to that later. Yeah, I think we're all glad that I got better lighting and a functional mic after that one. Ugh. So yeah, I detest Warrior Within. I absolutely loathe the very existence of this game, and most of the reasons why come down to this very concept. So, to illustrate some of the issues that can come up with trying to make a game darker and edgier, I'm going to talk a bit about Warrior Within and see where it went wrong, because it's an excellent example of how not to do this. In the first game, the prince was kind of a brat, and he grew more mature through the events of the game. But even so, he never went all emo or brooding or anything like that. He was still kind of playful and lighthearted at the end, and maybe still a little insecure, and ultimately he developed a more healthy worldview than the uber-masculine honor and glory mindset he started out with. Check him out in Warrior Within.
You will never reach our shores alive.
For your sake, you better hope I don't. You bitch! I don't think you understand how important this is. What are you doing? You've trapped us in here! Die, you bastard! What? What do you want?
I think the implication is supposed to be that being chased by a magical creature that fixes anomalies in time has changed him, and that makes a level of sense, but I think it went a little far. And the whole tone of the game has changed in the same ways. He's really violent and aggressive. He looks like a stereotypical brooding action hero instead of the entitled son of royalty he's supposed to be. The combat features dismemberment and buckets of blood, and the sexual exploitation... Yeah, I think that's supposed to be a thong, but I'm censoring it anyways because I'm pretty sure there's just nothing there. And I haven't seen a game camera linger this long on a woman's backside since Bayonetta. Everything's dark and colorless. Yuri Lowenthal was replaced by an actor who ranges from quietly angry to loudly angry, and the entire game just feels like it's screaming, "I'm an adult!" But the ultimate sin of this game is that none of this content is actually justified by the story. I mean, the plot isn't any more intense or mature than the previous game, and it doesn't really deal with any themes that this darkness could actually lend itself to. Like the loss of the prince's innocence, the dangers of messing around with supernatural forces, or even the issues of sexual frustration the creators of the game apparently need to work on a bit. And that's ultimately the major problem with this whole tendency. It sees darkness and edginess as a sign of maturity, when in fact, the two are very, very independent of one another. A work can be dark and mature, but it can also be lighthearted and mature, or dark and immature. Darkness and mature content don't suddenly make something mature, and if the rest of the work isn't as mature as the content is, all we get is a confused and juvenile piece of art that comes across like it desperately wants to play with the big boys, but doesn't know how. But surely there are some good examples too, right? I mean, like I said before, darkness is not a problem at all in and of itself. And I'm sure that we can all name a great variety of games that were spot on in this regard, where the story and the issues it dealt with were actually just as mature as the content and tone, and it all fit and came together well. So then, can we take a game that was previously lighthearted and fun and make it more serious and mature and do it right? Why, yes we can, and Naughty Dog's sequel to their classic PS2 platformer, Jak and Daxter, is possibly the best example out there. Whereas the first game was an E-rated platformer about jumping around with a witty animal sidekick, Jak 2 is rated T and features the characters getting sucked into the portal they made in the first game and Jak being captured and experimented on for years before Daxter rescues him. The first line this previously silent hero ever says is,
I'm gonna kill Praxis!
Yeah, this one's a bit darker than before, but thankfully it also has the narrative chops to back it up. Aside from not relying on excessive sexual exploitation or gore to make its point, Jak 2's story is actually about more mature themes than the first game. It takes place in a dystopia ruled by a vicious baron who's conducting experiments with dark eco, and those experiments have forced Jak to struggle with a dark part of himself. It's a story of corruption in every sense of the word, and ultimately the hope that it can be overcome. So even though Jak speaks and is kind of aggressive now, and the game added guns and generally just has a far darker tone than the first one, it feels surprisingly natural because it's more than just a surface darkness. The whole game and the whole story are about darker themes, so it was a welcome change to the series. So it's entirely possible to do this right, but it tends to be the exception rather than the rule. I honestly can't think of very many games aside from Jak 2 that went from a lower rating earlier in the series to a higher one later on and actually turned out well. I do have a couple on the shelf behind me there, but I mean, to be fair, that's mostly because I don't like spending money on terrible games, so there are a lot of really, really bad examples that I don't have to put there. We've had a darker reboot of Space Invaders that was completely needless and tonally scattershot, an attempt to turn the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise into something dark and serious, and even Max Payne 3 misinterpreted the already M-rated darkness of the excellent second game and turned into arbitrary juvenile violence porn. And really, we already know how not to fall into this trap. It's nothing new, and mediums like theater, music, and literature have moved past it a long time ago. Film is still working on it, but even so, it's still light years ahead of where video games are in this regard. So, what needs to happen before we can stop screwing this up quite so regularly? I know this is a kind of a broad answer, but I think the solution ultimately lies in self-confidence. Video games can be mature. They can be meaningful, they can be valuable, they're art. By the very nature of what they are, they can be these things. We don't need to question that, we don't need to prove it, it just is. But the more mature we try to be, the more desperate it makes us look. And that makes us look like children, not adults. Dark stories should be dark because their subject matter is dark, not just because we tried to force some false, insecure sense of maturity onto it. And the sooner we, as an industry and a community, recognize that, the sooner we can stop trying so hard to be taken seriously and simply be taken seriously. So whether you agree or disagree, go ahead and talk about it in the comments. And don't forget to like Games as Literature on Facebook, follow it on Twitter, and support it on Patreon if you're so inclined. Next week, I won't quite yet be doing the Little Inferno analysis due to yet more complications. But in the meantime, I'll do something that I haven't yet taken the time to do on this show. A top 5 countdown. So, join me next week for the top 5 8-bit video game songs, and until then, class is dismissed.